The steel spring still quivered as the last trace of the bark faded from the receiver. Watson stood frozen, his fingers hovering over the apparatus, every sense straining for another hint of that impossible sound. The laboratory smelled of hot metal and varnished wood, the air dense with the faint ozone of repeated experiments. On the bench, coils, magnets, and wires formed a tangled landscape, yet one casual vibration had slipped through it with uncanny clarity. He adjusted the tension on the spring, nudged the metal reed closer to the electromagnet, and pressed his ear again to the crude earpiece. With deliberate care, he struck the spring himself, listening as its tone travelled the wire. This time, the sound emerged as a thin, metallic twang, more familiar, yet still distinct from simple clicks. It rose and fell in a pattern that hinted at a continuous waveform, not the abrupt interruptions of the telegraph. From the next room, the dog barked once more, and Watson watched the spring shiver in response, catching the motion in the corner of his eye. Through the receiver, he heard a muffled but recognizable contour of the bark, its attack, swell, and decay preserved in miniature. The realization settled in with almost physical weight. The electrical current had not merely switched on and off, it had followed the changing shape of the sound itself along the wire. In crowded telegraph offices, operators bent over brass keys and clicking sounders, their fingers striking out dots and dashes that leapt across continents as bursts of current. Overhead, tangled wires followed streets and railroads, binding cities into a new nervous system of metal and code. Messages arrived as broken rhythms, never as flowing sound. No instrument in these rooms rendered a voice or a note, only the staccato logic of presence and absence. Into this world, Alexander Graham Bell walked the streets of Boston, already consumed by questions about how sound lived and changed in the air. He filled pages with sketches of vibrating reeds and membranes, then returned to dense German texts describing experiments by Hermann von Helmholtz. Helmholtz's resonators, glass bowls tuned to specific frequencies, had separated complex tones into simple components. For Bell, these measured vibrations suggested that voices and telegraph clicks shared the same underlying physics. Bell stood at his workbench, imagining a wire that carried more than one message at once, each assigned to its own pitch like instruments in an unseen orchestra. The proposed harmonic telegraph depended on steady, musical vibrations instead of abrupt pulses. As he compared Morse relays with diagrams of sound waves, the rigid on-off language of telegraphy seemed increasingly narrow. If a wire could sustain continuous motion, he wondered, then speech itself might someday ride along its length. Late in the day, the workshop had vibrated with a dense tangle of sounds. Coils hummed softly as current flowed, iron reeds trembled in their wooden frames, and scraps of wire lay coiled on the scarred bench. Alexander Graham Bell had leaned over a cluttered sketch, pointing to lines that stood for separate telegraph channels, each tied to a particular pitch. Beside him, Thomas Watson had tightened screws and nudged tiny springs, his fingers stained with oil and metal filings. On the bench, a row of slender steel reeds had waited like a mute choir, each cut to length for a distinct musical note. Watson had drawn a file across one, shaving it shorter so its tone rose, then held it near an electromagnet wired to a distant receiver. Bell had listened with his ear bent close, straining to distinguish the faint ring that answered from across the room, where another reed quivered in sympathy when current pulsed through the line. They had repeated the sequence again and again, sending one pitch, then another, sometimes both together, trying to keep each tone clear on the shared wire. Outside their focused circle of light, the building had continued its own careless orchestra. Footsteps creaked on stairways, a door slammed below, a hammer rang somewhere in the rear. Now and then a dog barked sharply in the yard. its abrupt cry cutting through the thin metallic music of the experimental reeds. The cluttered bench had smelled of oil, hot metal and dust as the experiment took shape piece by improvised piece. A strip of steel, clamped before an electromagnet, waited under a tangle of wire that snaked toward a crude receiver across the room. The diaphragm there rested in its frame with a slight looseness, sensitive to the faintest tremor. Outside, intermittent street noise drifted in, merging with quiet movements around the apparatus. The sharp bark came suddenly, cutting through the workshop's muffled sounds. The vibration struck the thin surfaces first, rattling the loosely mounted diaphragm and steel reed. The metal quivered in uneven patterns that matched the dog's rough staccato call. Each tiny deflection altered the current in the coil, carving a wavering electrical trace that rose and fell with the bark's rhythm, preserved its jagged edges, and carried that fleeting pattern along the length of the wire. At the receiver, the current's wavering strength pulled and released the iron core of the electromagnet, tugging the diaphragm in imperfect imitation of the original motion. As an ear pressed close, the air in front of the receiver vibrated with a coarse, broken cry. It lacked clarity, yet its uneven attack, abrupt cut-off, and ragged texture matched the memory of the bark, revealing that speech-like sounds could ride an electric pathway. The barking echo had unfolded as a lesson in moving energy from one medium to another. The dog's throat had driven air into rapid compression and rarefaction, forming a complex pressure wave that struck a thin metal reed. Each surge and dip of air displaced the reed by tiny amounts, and its motion, in turn, disturbed the magnetic field around a nearby electromagnet, where wire coils waited to translate movement into current. As the reed vibrated, the magnetic field around the coil had swelled and weakened in a pattern that mirrored the bark's changing intensity. This shifting field induced a continuously varying electrical current in the wire, rising and falling with the same intricate contour as the original sound. Instead of discrete telegraph clicks, the circuit now carried an electrical analogue of the bark's waveform, preserving its timing, loudness, and tonal structure. At the far end of the wire, another electromagnet and reed responded to those electrical undulations, pulling and releasing in synchrony. The second reed pushed against the surrounding air, recreating a rough facsimile of the original pressure pattern. This sequence echoed the workings of the human ear, where a vibrating eardrum moved tiny structures that converted sound into nerve impulses, a parallel that strongly resonated with Alexander Graham Bell's ongoing experiments in auditory perception and speech. In the cramped workshop, the sharp report of the dog's bark still hung in memory as Alexander Graham Bell turned back to his sketches. For years he had traced the delicate curves of the cochlea, memorized the chain of tiny bones behind the eardrum, and studied diagrams of the basilar membrane. He had pored over reports of Hermann von Helmholtz's vowel machines, where electrically driven tuning forks carved pure tones into the air like controlled vibrations of a mechanical larynx. Bell already believed that every complex sound was a tapestry woven from simpler vibrations. Telegraph wires had taught him how separate signals could ride together on the same conductor, each with its own pitch. Helmholtz had shown that vowels could be dissected into harmonic components. Now the dog's bark, reported and imitated by his assistant, pressed against this conviction. If such a jagged, irregular sound could be recognized after passing through a vibrating membrane, perhaps any sound might be carried the same way. Over his notebooks, Bell drew thin circles for diaphragms and marked them with arrows that stood for motion, then traced lines outward as electric currents that rose and fell instead of merely switching on and off. Telegraph clicks gave way on the page to undulating waves. In letters he described currents that varied in exact sympathy with external vibrations, so that another diaphragm far away might move in step and recreate a recognizable cry, word, or bark in a listening ear. The workbench lay crowded with coils of wire, iron cores, and slender frames that now held thin circular membranes. Bell and his assistant fixed each diaphragm so it rested just before the pole of an electromagnet, close enough to feel every pressure change in the air. When a voice disturbed the membrane, it flexed inward and outward, and the vibrating metal altered the electric current running along the wire that linked the two devices. They tightened screws, shifted magnets by fractions of an inch, and tested different diaphragm materials, listening for faint changes in clarity. By early June 1875, they heard more than clicks and buzzes. Long, drawn-out tones passed along the wire, stretching into recognizable vowel-like sounds. The crude syllables emerged from the receiver's diaphragm as it quivered in sympathy, proving that complex, continuous sound could cross a circuit once designed only for telegraph pulses. Months of adjustment followed, guided by memory of that first unexpected dog's bark travelling as a flowing signal. On March 10th, 1876, Bell bent over the transmitter, its diaphragm poised before the magnet, and spoke clearly into the mouthpiece. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." In the adjoining room, the distant receiver trembled and formed the words audibly. Watson heard them, understood, and hurried in, stunned by the successful passage of spoken language along a wire. In the years that followed, the Boston experiments, polished oak boxes and brass fittings appeared on office walls, replacing messengers and written notes with spoken words over wire. Clerks lifted heavy receivers, leaned toward transmitters, and discovered that a distant partner's hesitation or urgency could now be heard as clearly as the words themselves. Contract terms, shipment orders, and stock prices travelled as fleeting electrical variations born from vibrating diaphragms and moving magnets. Soon, exchanges occupied crowded rooms where operators sat in rows before towering switchboards. Many were young women, chosen for calm voices and precise diction, their hands darting among cords and jacks as they announced connections and linked one line to another. Each completed circuit carried a conversation that depended on the same principle once proven with a dog's bark, that complex waves of pressure could ride a wire as corresponding ripples of current. Outside, streets bristled with poles and crossarms as cables stretched between rooftops and along railroad rights-of-way. Urban districts filled quickly with interlaced routes, while rural communities joined more slowly, a few farmhouses at a time, tapping into distant towns. On expanding maps, shaded regions of service spread from city centres outward, but every new connection still relied on a vibrating diaphragm, an induced current, and a distant receiver restoring sound to a recognizable human voice. In later years, Thomas Watson's own words provided the clearest window into the moment. In his memoirs, he recalled leaning close to crude transmitters and receivers, then suddenly recognizing distinct noises that had crossed the wire. Among them, he wrote, came the sharp, familiar sound of a dog barking, carried not as a vague buzz, but as a shaped, convincing signal. The experience, he noted, left him astonished that such lifelike noise had survived the journey. Historians sifted through these reminiscences alongside surviving notebooks and lab journals. Watson's descriptions, given decades after the experiments, were compared with terse entries in patent records and Alexander Graham Bell's own notes on diaphragm designs and circuit adjustments. Researchers examined dates, locations, and apparatus details, separating what could be firmly documented from what remained plausible reconstruction. Yet Watson's repeated mention of the dog's bark across interviews and writings marked it as a persistent personal milestone. Placed beside other stories of discovery, the episode followed a recognizable pattern. Wilhelm Röntgen had noticed an unexpected glow and realized new rays existed. Percy Spencer had found a chocolate bar melted in his pocket near radar equipment and inferred unseen energy at work. In Boston, the audible bark impressed itself on a listener already prepared by study and experiment. The sound arrived as chance, but its meaning emerged from disciplined, methodical attention. The dog stood near the crowded bench, its paws shifting on bare floorboards as tools and wires lay scattered in the lamplight. A sudden bark cut through the laboratory air, startling the men who leaned over their improvised apparatus. The sound shook thin metal, travelled through coils, and pressed itself into a trembling receiver. No one in that room expected an animal's cry to carry so cleanly along a length of wire. From that moment, a path had unfolded that joined rough timber tables and humming relay coils to glass screens and pocket-sized radios. The principle remained the same. A wavering pressure in air became an electrical pattern, then returned again as sound. What once had been a surprising echo of a dog's bark now underpinned voices that crossed oceans, bounced off satellites, and threaded through hidden fibre beneath streets and seabeds. Old photographs showed Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant posed stiffly beside early instruments, their expressions formal, the equipment ungainly. Intercut images revealed crowded trains, busy cafes, and city sidewalks where people spoke casually into mobile phones, their words digitized and reassembled far away. Behind the ordinariness of their conversations lingered a fragile history, in which a single unexpected burst of sound in a Boston workshop had exposed the power hidden in a simple wire.